Oh well, I mean, shall we then jump into that? As I said, this is would be the interview for the September issue. For the
Yes.
we have David Luke, which recorded last week, I guess. Yeah. Yeah. And kind of the three I have, like the as I wrote in the email, the three-part structure. Let's start with your article on vision. Then we'll have the course on Huxley starting in September. It would be very interesting to hear your thoughts on that subject. And the central theme of the September paper is revelation. So if we could just at the end lead
Yes.
It's different. Go ahead.
That would be, I think it's a very interesting theme, and it's one that is very rarely discussed nowadays. So it's a good thing to do that.
You mean revelation?
Yes.
Yeah. That's very interesting. So, so let's jump right into that. Please talk about the. I mean, you've been interested in the ideas and theories of vision for quite some time, right? I remember that the Science Delusion had the chapter on vision, didn't it?
Yes.
So please give us the background of this article on vision.
The nature of vision is surprisingly unexplained. I mean, you might assume that we understood one of the most immediate parts of our own experience, but actually it turns out we don't. And it's a profound mystery. In fact, it's one of the most profound mysteries of everyday life. You know, I'm interested in the mysteries of everyday life. And the very fact we can see things is one of those mysteries. From the time of ancient Greece onwards, there was a long debate about vision in the ancient world, then in the Arab world, and then in medieval Europe. And the main emphasis of the debate was one school of thought emphasized the importance of the light coming into the eyes, the light that comes in, called intromission, sending in. The other school of thought was concerned mainly with how we project images out, called extramission. And one of the main proponents of the extramission theory was Euclid, the great Greek geometer, who was writing around 300 BC. And Euclid said that when we see things, as it were, visual rays go out of our eyes to project the image that we're seeing. Excuse me. So the idea that vision involves something coming out of the eyes as well as light coming in was widely considered in the ancient world, and most people thought that vision involved something coming out of the eyes as well as light coming in. Well, in 1604, Johannes Kepler showed that the light coming into the eyes was focused by the lens to give inverted images on the retinas. Now, no one had known that before, and this was a remarkable triumph at the beginning of modern science. And after that, people said, well, we now know that vision's explained, the light comes in, the images form at the back of the eyes, and that's explained it. There's no need for mysterious influences going out of the eyes. But the fact is, as Kepler himself admitted, it didn't explain it, because what his theory explained was two small inverted images, one in each eye. But when we see the world, we're not seeing two small inverted images. We're seeing one image the right way up. And moreover, we're seeing the images outside ourselves where they seem to be. So my image of you and Kaye right now is on the screen of my computer about 50 centimeters in front of my face. What Euclid was saying is that we actually, the light comes in, yes, but we project the images out to where they seem to be. Now, since Kepler, the idea that anything's projected out has been a taboo in Western science. It's been regarded as a superstition, a primitive belief, something that's believed in by savages, by primitive people, by uneducated people, and by children. And children do, in fact, believe that, as the psychologist Jean Piaget showed. So they deny that anything's projected out, except in physics textbooks, when they're trying to explain mirror images, they actually use Euclid's theory of visual rays projected out. And in the physics textbook, you see a picture of a mirror. You see the ray, the light goes like that, but from the eye, the visual rays go out to the mirror and carry on straight through it to produce a virtual image behind the mirror. And this is what Euclid showed in 300 BC, and it's still in every school textbook today. So students are taught, on the one hand, that light and vision only involves light coming in, nothing goes out, it's all inside the brain. On the other hand, to explain visual images in mirrors, they're told that there's a projection of images. And in fact, we experience this projection every time we look into a mirror. We're seeing things behind the mirror that aren't really there, but are projected there by the way our vision works. So there's a peculiar situation in academic science, and indeed in our whole culture, where there's a denial that anything comes out of the eyes, that the mind is extended outwards. And yet, people are taught that in order to explain mirror images. And so most people are utterly confused and don't know what to believe. And in practice, most people believe that we do project images out, that my image of you is right where it seems to be, 50 centimeters in front of my head, instead of being mysteriously inside the brain. But the scientifically correct theory is that inside my brain, there's a small image of Hardo and Kaye, somewhere inside my head in three-dimensional image in full color inside the brain. Well, no one's ever seen images inside the brain. It's an incoherent theory, and yet it's the official theory. So what I'm doing in my paper on visual perception, written with Alex Gomez-Marin, is looking at these traditional theories and then saying, well, how could we actually test this? Instead of just arguing about it for another 2,500 years, we could actually arrive at some conclusion. And if I'm projecting something out and my mind is reaching out to touch what I'm looking at, then if I look at somebody from behind, they may feel I'm looking at them. The sense of being stared at, or scoposthesia as it's called in science, may be real. Well, 95% of people have experienced the sense of being stared at. They turn around to find someone staring at them. And over 90% have experienced looking at other people and seeing they turn around. And this happens with animals too. In fact, I think it evolved in the context of predator-prey relationships, that a prey animal that could tell when a hidden predator was looking at it would escape better than one that couldn't tell. So here's a very common phenomenon, the sense of being stared at, or scoposthesia, which is evidence for something coming, an influence coming out of the eyes. And yet this evidence is systematically ignored or denied within the scientific world on the grounds it can't possibly happen, it can't be true, therefore all the evidence can simply be ignored. So we have a ridiculous situation where we have a common experience that the vast majority of humans, including children, have experienced, something that happens commonly with animals, which is systematically denied in order to support an incoherent theory that it's all inside the brain, while the very same scientists believe when they're looking in a mirror, it's not all inside the brain. So it's a complete muddle. And the paper we wrote is an attempt to clarify this. And if we think of the vision as involving an outward projection of images, it shows our minds are more extensive than our brains. So it raises a big question about the nature of the mind. The mind's not just inside the head, in the brain, it extends outwards, and I think extends outwards through fields, mental fields or perceptual fields. And so there is something that's projected out, not just light coming in. So that's why I'm interested in it, and why I think this research is of more general importance.
And it has also, as you mentioned, profound philosophical implications, doesn't it? Because just one sentence that particularly intrigued me in the paper was that by qualifying the noun mind with a battery of adjectives, extended, embodied, embedded, inactive, ecological, Descartes' res cogitans is made extensa. Could you just please, I mean, in a sense, you touched already upon that theme, but could you just elaborate on that sentence a bit more?
Well, the famous Cartesian dualism that has dominated Western thinking since Descartes, and who first had this vision in 1619. Descartes had the idea that the reality is divided into two separate realms. One is the realm of matter, which he called res extensa, extended stuff. And matter is the whole of physical nature. It's the whole of the stars, the planets, the earth, animals, plants, human bodies, animal bodies, everything, crystals, rocks. All of that is extended in space and time. And that's res extensa. But he then said that the other division of reality is spirit, which is, or consciousness, which is not in space and time. It's transcendent of nature, it's supernatural, and that realm includes God, angels, and human minds, human rational minds. So the only thing in the entire natural world which has both connected together is the human brain, because he thought that the human mind interacted with the physical mechanism of the brain in the pineal gland. So he had the idea that matter is unconscious but extended, and spirit is conscious but unextended. It's not extended in space. And that's one reason that the idea of the projection of the mind in visual perception has been ignored in science, because if the mind is not spatial, if it's somehow outside space and time, then there's no way the mind can be projected out as an extended in an extended way into the environment. But of course, I mean, it's a ridiculous theory, and the minute you think about it, because of course our minds are extended. When I see you now, when I look around my room that I'm sitting in, everything I'm seeing is extended, and that's a perception in my mind, and therefore these perceptions are extended, they're in the mind is extended through perceptions. So the idea is completely unextended may be plausible if you're a mathematician like Descartes, and you think that the ultimate reality is mathematical, somehow transcendent beyond space and time. But even Descartes, who is a great geometry, even mathematics is extended, the whole point of geometry, which is one of his paradigmatic examples for the rational mind, the understanding of geometry. Geometry is by definition extended. It's all about lines and triangles and angles and stuff, which are extended in space. So what we're saying there is that if we think about the extended mind through perception, all these other people who are thinking about it are always trying to get back to an idea of the mind being extended without actually saying so, or at least without saying that it's extended in a way that makes a difference. But they're all attempts to, the inactive theory, the ecological perception, all of these, the adjectives are attempts to make the mind extended. And we just think that it's very important philosophically to recognize, yes, our minds are extended in space and time. All our experiences are in space and time, except perhaps for a few mystical experiences that go beyond space and time. Even our dreams are extended in space and time. They are processes, they have people moving around in rooms and outdoor spaces and so on. Even those are extended in space and time.
There was another quite intriguing sentence that the neuroscientist Stephen Lehar, I think, argues that when you look at the sky you see is inside your brain. How do you make sense of what's going on there? I mean, that's just by contrast. Okay, let's take it from there. And
well, Lehar is a materialist philosopher, and Lehar is simply taking the materialist point of view to its logical extreme and pointing out how paradoxical it is. He's not opposing it. He's just saying, if you're a materialist, this is what you actually believe, and this is what I believe. That I look at the sky, and I'm doing that now, through my window, and the sky I'm looking at, that I'm experiencing, it seems to be out there, but all our experience is, in fact, according to materialists, inside our brain. So I'm looking at the sky, it seems to be very far away, and when I look at stars at night, they seem far, far away. But all of that's inside my head. And so my skull is beyond the sky that I'm experiencing. And he wrote this paper called Is Your Skull Beyond the Sky? A provocative paper in which he answers yes. Well, most materialists don't think it through. They prefer not to think about it at all because it's such a muddle. But he thought it through and recognized that it leads to this absurd conclusion, which nevertheless he accepts because he's a materialist.
Right. Just avert the idea of extended mind. He's willing to talk about extended skull, basically.
Yes, the extended skull. He thinks of it as a virtual reality display inside the skull, which includes the sky and everything we experience. It even includes a virtual skull, because I can see my own head in a mirror, for example. So the skull we're seeing when we look at ourselves in a mirror, the head we're seeing is an image inside our brains, and the real skull is beyond all the perceptual images we have, including the sky.
Oh, and the other interesting thing I picked up, you mentioned it already, that in psychology, in psychology and biology, students are taught intromission. Was it intromission? Yeah. No.
Yes.
Yeah, intromission,
like,
and in physics, extramission, and that reminded me a quote by Will Durant, who said that the contemporary philosophy can be presented as a struggle or warfare between physics and psychology. Just perhaps we'll end that section of our conversation by commenting on that point by Durant.
Well, it's not really a struggle because nobody thinks about it, you see. It's not as if physicists say to biologists, you're wrong, the real image is going out. Yeah, they just have these things in physics textbooks to explain mirror images. They have to explain them somehow. And once they've explained it in elementary physics textbooks, they don't think about it anymore. So instead of struggling with psychologists and biologists, they simply ignore the problem. And talk in terms of virtual images produced by projections from the eye and stuff, but they don't really think it through. If they had done, this would have been a debate that would have been going on for the last 300 or 400 years, but there's been no debate at all worth speaking of, because it simply, Kepler's theory is one of the oldest established theories in science. Most people date the origin of modern science to the 17th century. And Kepler's discovery in 1604 is like one of the most venerable discoveries. It comes before Galileo and before Newton and before Descartes. So this theory of intromission being the only theory of vision is so deeply established in the habits of scientific thinking, such a venerable thing that hardly anyone challenges or even thinks about it. And that's why we've been stuck for such a long time with such a weird theory of mind. And it's why there's such a strong taboo about research on the sense of being stared at. The total number of papers published on this between 1885 and 1985 was 4 in the entire world scientific literature, and 2 of them were by skeptics who said this is nothing but an illusion, and the other 2 were empirical studies that showed positive results. But instead of there being on newspaper headlines about them, they were buried in very obscure publications in the psychic research literature and rarely discussed or mentioned by anybody. So it's not as if this is one of the areas that people have been thinking about. They've been trying not to think about it.
Yeah, I just read this Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell, and those your ideas very much correlated with Huxley's. For instance, that he said that light, color, and significance do not exist in isolation. And he says that it's man's luxury to see colors. How do you put those colors into this visionary world?
Well, I think that when light comes into our eyes and goes to our brains, that sets up vibratory patterns in the brain, which everyone agrees about that. There's sort of electrical activity in the brain that you can measure with brain scanners and things. Then, I mean, this is the great mystery. How does this activity in the mind relate to our perceptual experience? Somehow, in a way that nobody understands, the physical activity of the brain is associated with an extended three-dimensional world, which is, I'm suggesting, projected outwards, including colors and qualia and all those subjectively experienced things. This is the hard problem of consciousness. No one knows. I don't know. No one knows how this actually happens. I think it helps in thinking about it to recognize that what's happening is extended in space. It's not just inside the brain. And we have, particular set of vibrations going on in the brain, electrical vibrations that result in an extended spatial and colored experience. And you could, I suppose, compare it to, a gramophone record or an old-fashioned gramophone record. It's just a series of grooves in a gramophone record, and the needle goes through the grooves, vibrating at different frequencies. And this, when amplified, sets up vibration at those frequencies in loudspeakers. They're just vibrating surfaces, and yet they create a three-dimensional world of music, which can have enormous effects on us, full of qualities. You could hear the Beatles, or you can hear Bach, or you can hear heavy metal or something. These vibrations, which are localized in the loudspeaker, are associated with a spread out, subjectively experienced world of qualities extended in space. And in a similar kind of way, in an analogous way, the vibrations in our brains are somehow associated with a spread out visual world with colors and qualities. But how you get from vibration to quality is a very old problem that no one solved. I mean, after all, Pythagoras was really into this in ancient Greece. What he realized was there's a relationship between the length of flutes. If you have a flute that's twice as long, it's an octave lower. And so you can have a ratio of length 1 to 2, and in terms of length of a flute. And it's an octave lower, which is not just a vibration, but also something we actually experience as a tone, an octave lower. And so what Pythagoras was doing was showing that in music you have, on the one hand, mathematically describable ratios and proportions, which are objective and lacking in any quality, but they're somehow associated with all the qualities we experience and all the emotions we experience when we listen to music, and the qualities of the tones. And although he showed there's a relationship between quantity, namely lengths and vibrations and frequencies and ratios, and quality, which we experience in music, he showed there was this relationship 2,500 years ago. We haven't really come much further since then. We've shown that there are vibrations in the brain, vibratory activity, which are associated with qualities and conscious experiences extended in space. But exactly how they're related, he couldn't explain and we can't explain. So it is one of the great unsolved mysteries of science and philosophy. But I think in trying to solve it, we're better off recognizing that the mind is extended rather than pretending it isn't. So it doesn't solve the problem, but it of quality, but it makes it a more realistic discussion if we recognize there really is this extended quality of experience, including colors and what are called qualia, those subjectively experienced qualities that perception involves.
Yeah. Yeah. Huxley also mentioned that many things are starting from education, and he highlights that we are too verbal. And one Goethe's quote I really liked. Huxley wrote it down that we talk far too much. We should talk less and draw more.
Very good.
Yes. Well, I mean, Goethe was obviously very interested in these things. The color theory of Goethe was an attempt to show that Newton's accounts of colors as vibrations of light, different wavelengths of light, just simply doesn't explain the qualities, and that we have to take into account the way we perceive things to explain qualities. And Newton had left all of that out. And Goethe showed that that's an essential part of any theory of color, the way we respond to colors, and the way when we see in particular contrasts of light, the colors that we're seeing change. It's not as if they're totally objective. There are all sorts of visual illusions where the same stimulus can look a different color depending on what colors are surrounding it. So Goethe showed, really emphasized the subjective or the interpretive nature of our minds in responding to light waves, which Newton ignored. So yes, I mean, that's all very important part of it. I mean, another thing of Aldous Huxley that's important, I think, is that instead of thinking that our brains produce consciousness, he thought that our brains are more like valves or reducing valves, that through which consciousness is reduced. Otherwise we'd be overwhelmed if we had total consciousness of everything, that our brains are kind of restricting or channeling consciousness, they're not producing it. So you see, if you start with a kind of idealist philosophy, which all religions do in a way, if you start with consciousness, then if you say the ultimate reality is conscious, then that ultimate reality includes colors and shapes and forms and qualities, that they're there to start with. And what our senses do is enable us to activate aspects of this basic conscious experience, which was there long before the senses, that in a sense, the mind of God includes all possibilities and all qualities. And so you don't have to explain qualities if you start from qualities. If you start from quantities, then it's very hard to see how you can get to qualities at all. I mean, that's the hard problem of consciousness. If you start from quantities of nerve impulses or nerves or neurotransmitters, you can't get to qualities. There's no way you can make that leap. That's why it's called the hard problem. And Descartes tried to solve it by just having these two realms, the realm of quantity and the realm of quality. But obviously they come together in our perception, and how they're related is, that's the great outstanding problem.
Guy, I read Laws of Perception. I just finished Perennial Philosophy. I don't know, when did you read this book, if at all, and what do you think Huxley is after in that book?
Well, the Laws of Perception or the Perennial Philosophy?
Perennial Philosophy in this particular case. That's what I just finished.
Oh, well, I have read it, yes, but many years ago, so I couldn't give you exact quotes or anything. But basically, what I take the perennial philosophy to mean, it's not just Huxley that's put this idea forward, but a variety of other thinkers, that basically the perennial philosophy, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it is that there's an underlying consciousness. All reality has an underlying unitary consciousness, which is a united consciousness, which is then expressed through the material world and the world of nature. But underlying everything is a realm of conscious experience, and our own consciousness is a part of that ultimate or fundamental consciousness, a small limited part of it. Some people talk of a spark of the divine light or something, or a reflection of the divine consciousness. I mean, a Hindu analogy is that if you have lots of buckets of water at night and you see the moon reflected in each bucket, it looks as if there are hundreds of moons because there's one in each bucket, but it's one moon reflected in each bucket, and that our own consciousness is like that. So that's a philosophy that seems to underlie all religions, because all religions take it for granted that you start from consciousness. You don't start from matter, you start from consciousness. So in the Judeo-Christian tradition, you start with God, and then God creates, the Spirit of God moves on the face of the water, first of all creates waves, vibration, and then God said, let there be light. And you have light and darkness, which are separated. And so you have and then you have a gradual appearance of the earth, the stars, planets, plants, animals, and so forth. But consciousness comes first. So it does in Islam, so it does in Hinduism, so it does in Buddhism, although they don't deal very much with cosmology, but they start with the kind of consciousness as the primary phenomenon. And so in that sense, all the perennial philosophy is something that's shared between all these different traditions. They all interpret it differently, put it into different language, different metaphors, different mythologies, but they have this in common. And moreover, mystical experience, experienced by Sufis, Christian mystics, Hindu mystics, Buddhist mystics, also have in common that they connect the experiencer with this larger consciousness, a consciousness much greater than their own. And people feel this connection with something much greater than themselves. It's usually a joyful experience and a feeling of ultimate reality. Now that's how I interpret it. Is that more or less what you found in Huxley's book? Or
yeah, that's pretty much so. But I remember you in one of your lectures you talked about the brief encounter with Julian Huxley, I guess, but you did not meet personally Aldous Huxley. That was like 20 years. You were 20.
No, I never knew Aldous Huxley. I mean, I read his book. I read Doors of Perception when I was about 17. So he was quite a formative influence on my own thinking. I met Julian Huxley once when he gave a talk at Cambridge when I was an undergraduate. He lived near where we live in London, in Hampstead. And so after he died, I knew his widow very well. He was Sir Julian Huxley. Lady Juliette Huxley was she was Swiss by origin, Swiss-French. And she was in her 90s, but we became very friendly. And when our children were young, I used to take them round and I'd go for tea and the children would play. And she had great grandchildren, and so she was used to having young children. And so she was like a grandmother figure or a great grandmother for our own children, Merlin and Cosmo. And it was Sir Julian's house, his library and stuff. We'd had tea in his library and stuff. So I felt his presence. And then Julian and Juliette's son, Francis Huxley, who was an anthropologist, was a good friend of mine. We knew him very well. He lived in Hampstead and then later in America. And so, he was one of my close friends. So I've always felt a strong connection with that tradition. It's interesting, you see that T.H. Huxley, who was Darwin's defender and propagandist, who was their great-grandfather, I think he was great-grandfather of Francis, was very much a kind of militant agnostic and secularist who was very anti-religion and had a very, scientistic. He really believed in science and as a kind of new religion, and he saw scientists as a kind of new priesthood. Well, Sir Julian, in a sense, continued that tradition, but Aldous didn't, and Aldous moved away and came from an atheistic family. came to a new appreciation of religious and mystical traditions, partly through taking psychedelics and partly through his study of the different mystical traditions. And Francis was much more like Aldous than like his father Julian. Was much more interested in this broader view of consciousness, and as an anthropologist studied it as it was experienced in different cultures, including the Amazon, among tribes in the Amazon where he did some field work, and also in Haiti where he did field work. Yes, so Aldous's context was that he was, in a sense, moving away from a sort of narrow reductionist, materialist worldview of science, rediscovering. So it's not as if he was a religious person trying to justify religion in a scientific world. He was a scientific person who was rediscovering the religious traditions of the world and the mystical experiences that go with them. And in that sense, he was a prophetic figure in a secular world where, many people come out of this non-religious background, dominated by science. And he showed a way out of this into a much broader view.
Yeah. Huxley says that visionary experience and mystical experience are not the same. How do you explain it?
What differentiate?
Well, yeah.
Well, I'm not quite sure what he meant. I can't remember that bit. So what do you think he means as the difference between them?
As I understand, he says that mystical experience is beyond the realm of opposites, but visionary experience is still within that realm.
Well, in time and space, and the mystical is beyond time and space. Was one way.
I see. Well, I don't know. I'd find it rather hard to distinguish between them because, it's possible to have mystical experiences that are completely beyond time and space. Some people do, but a lot of people have experiences within time and space. For example, people who have a mystical experience of nature may find themselves at a beautiful sunset or beautiful plants or something, and feel the presence of God or the divine or of a higher consciousness, and feel they're in the presence of something vastly greater than themselves. That is a kind of mystical experience in that sense. And yet it's not beyond time and space because you're still seeing beautiful flowers or beautiful scenery. I suppose he'd call that visionary. But I think a lot of people's mystical experiences involve both. Certainly in my own case, I've had experiences I'd think of as kind of mystical experiences that involve, on the one hand, actual visual experience or musical experience. You can listen to a piece of music that deeply moves you, and feel like, in my case, Bach is the composer that does it for me most. That is enormously powerful and moving. And the reason it's so powerful and moving is it's no longer just the sounds, it's opening up the sense of being present to a greater consciousness, something much greater than oneself. So maybe he'd call that visionary rather than mystical, but I don't think it's so easy to make that distinction.
Right. The next course we have, maybe you know that we have two course series here. One is Great Books, in which we'll plan the Huxley's course, but after that there will be the Return of Nature course series, in which your 7 experiments, in which we discussed in the 3rd season, we discussed your 7 experiments. That now we have the 6th season coming up, and this is devoted on Kyriakos Markides's The Mountain of Silence. I know that you mentioned in one of your emails that you've read one of Markides's one of the books by Markides. Which one was that, and which was your takeaway from that book?
Well, I haven't actually read it. I've seen them. Somebody sent me a copy of 3 volumes of Martinus's books.
Markides.
Martinus. Are you talking about
Markides, the Greek? Maybe you misheard. The one who writes on Greek Orthodox tradition.
Oh, which who again? What?
In one of your emails, I think the name came up. Kyriakos Markides. He's written on the Mount Athos and this kind. Maybe
Oh, yes, yes. I can't really remember very much about that. This is the Greek visionary mystic, Greek Orthodox mystic.
he was a sociologist in the University of Maine, but started to write on these Greek healers, and eventually ended up going to Mount Athos and wrote the book on that.
Oh, is he the one that wrote The Sage of Strobolos?
Yeah, I think yes.
Oh, yes. Now I know what we're talking about. Yes. I thought you were talking about Martinus, the the Danish visionary philosopher.
Oh.
No, well, I can't. I read it years ago. I can't remember what the main, but it was about the kind of the mystical Christianity or the mystical vision.
Exactly.
I can't really remember the details. So, what's the key point that you're interested in about it?
I think it's more like what he says about Huxley again, who is the most main focus. He says that Huxley is the turning point on the Western civilization return to the more mystical sense of life. What do you think of what do you think of this this idea by Markides?
I see. Well, I think Huxley was certainly one of the people who was part of that transition, and he was the one who was probably most aware of the scientific worldview.
Mm-hmm.
But there were other philosophers in the 20th century who were René Guénon, Syed Hussein Nasser.
What was it?
Syed Syed Hussein, Hussein, Nasser, Nasr, who was a kind of Sufi philosopher. I think he lived in Paris. I mean, he's very sophisticated, knew all about Western philosophy, but again, sort of worked from the mystical tradition. Was aware of the mystical tradition and tried to bring it into the modern world. So I would say there were other people doing this who were writing about what we could call the perennial philosophy. But Huxley probably had the highest profile and probably reached the most people, partly because he connected it with psychedelics, whereas the others didn't. They connected it with traditional religious meditational practices. And also partly because Huxley, because he came from a scientific family, was able to tie it in with modern science. And so, yes, I would say he was, a key figure in this cultural transition, right, which is still going on, of course. Right. There are plenty of people who still haven't read Aldous Huxley or have never heard of the perennial philosophy.
Huxley was friends with Houston Smith, by whom I assume you must have met in Esselen, or were you familiar with Houston Smith?
Yes, I've met Houston Smith, and I've been at conferences with him, and I did meet him at Esselen. And I took it that his work is really looking at the mystical element in different religious traditions and showing that there's a lot in common between them. Yeah. And this was, of course, a major point. It wasn't a new point for me because you may remember I lived in the ashram of Father Bede Griffiths in India. And Father Bede was a Benedictine monk, a British Benedictine monk who'd lived for many years in India, who was very deeply immersed not only in the Christian mystical tradition, but also in the Upanishads and the Hindu, the Buddhist, and the mystical traditions, and who also spoke very strongly about the connection of all these different traditions. One of Father Bede's favorite images would he'd say that if you take the hand, this mystical experience of oneness is like the palm of the hand, and that's from which all religions come. They all come from a direct experience of the ultimate reality. You know, the Buddha didn't become enlightened through studying at university, and Jesus didn't get his way he was through doing a PhD. I mean, they had direct experiences, the founders of all the great sages of the Upanishads. So they start from this experience of unity, and then they have to translate it into their own language, their own culture, their own mythology, their own philosophical background. Then it differentiates, like the fingers of the hand, into the different religious traditions, but they're all rooted in this central core of mystical experience. So I thought Father Bede's explanation for me was very clear, and in India it's fairly widely taken for granted. I mean, Hindus on the whole take the view that all religions come from a common source and they all have their different ways of expressing it. This is a kind of exoteric mainstream view in India, and until the very intolerant government of Modi that they now have, unfortunately, it was the kind of standard view that you'd encounter among educated Hindus all the time. It was completely standard. I mean, you know, when I told people in India I was a Christian, they were normal response would be, "Oh, very good, you know, all paths lead to God." And so, and another metaphor that Hindus often bring up is that the ultimate experience is like the top of a mountain, and different religions are like different paths going up different sides but they all arrive at the same point at the top. That's another of their common metaphors.
Yeah, I think it was also Father Pete Griffith who said that when you asked that how can, or somebody asked that how can you chant the Quadrimonte in Catholic Church, and he said that wouldn't be Catholic if you exclude something. Was that the case?
Yes, I asked him how in a Catholic ashram, Roman Catholic ashram, the service of the Mass began with the chanting of the Gayatri mantra, which is a very well-known Hindu mantra invoking the blessing of the divine light of the sun on our meditation. And that's when he said, you know, well, we can chant it precisely because it's a Catholic ashram. Catholic means universal. And if it denies any part of the truth, then it's not universal, it's simply a sect. So he took this very, very inclusive view of paths to the ultimate.
Right. Well, we've approached the last kind of 15 minutes of the meeting. Just to recall the key theme of the newspaper that we're putting together is revelation. What's your how would you approach this, or what associations does this word bring up in you?
Well, it's really interesting you're doing this, because I don't know anyone else who's discussed revelation in recent years, except within sort of narrow branches of theology, where it's obviously a common topic. But in a more general framework, revelation has tended to have a very negative connotation for rationalists and materialists and modern people who've been educated in the Enlightenment worldview. In the Enlightenment worldview, which is still the basis of our educational system, the emphasis was on science, reason, and progress. And the emphasis there is on, you know, clear understanding of nature through scientific methods and through evidence and reason and stuff. And revelation, you know, when religious people would say, well, they'd say, well, how can you prove God exists? Well, religious people would say, well, it was revealed to Moses, or it was revealed to Jesus, or these were revealed to the prophets. Revelation. Then they say, well, what use is that? They're just subjective experiences, and, you know, we want science, reason, and evidence. And so revelation was dismissed, and very widely dismissed, and most religious people didn't even try to defend it outside the religious context. So I think it's had a very negative press for a very long time. So it's fascinating that you're doing this, because if in fact you ask people in the modern world how they know what's happening or how they interpret their own experiences. I had someone ring me up just this morning, in fact, who'd had an amazing experience with a retreat with ayahuasca, and he'd then combined in this retreat, they'd combined it with holotropic breathing, and he said that this had led to this amazing experience of the light. He felt he'd gone into the light, and it was the most profound experience of his whole life. And he now saw everything quite differently. And because he knew there was a consciousness beyond all these things, there was this light, this realm of joy, etc. For him, this was immensely persuasive. He says this, I think, is going to change my life in the most profound way. Now, that's a revelation. It's a direct experience. And all psychedelic experience is revelation in using the traditional word. And in the modern world, for lots of people, psychedelic and other mystical experiences have a very high credibility. People who have mystical experiences of nature or through near-death experiences. I mean, it doesn't have to involve drugs. I mean, plenty of mystical experiences happen spontaneously or as a result of spiritual practices with no drugs at all. But all these experiences of a direct connection of a fundamental unity underlying all things, of a conscious unity, are direct experiences and therefore count as revelation. They're not arrived at through scientific experiments in laboratories. They're not arrived at through mathematical deduction from the laws of quantum physics. They're not arrived at through doing Euclidean geometry or the differential calculus. So they're arrived at through this direct experience. And so I think actually that what's causing or underlying the revival of interest in mystical traditions in the modern world precisely is revelation. And the thing is about the revelation, it's not communicable directly. I mean, someone can tell you they had this incredible experience that's convinced them that God's real and that we live in this greater unity and consciousness and that all is ultimately love and so on. But that's not going to convince somebody else unless, well, they might interest them, but unless they have that experience themselves, also at least some glimpse of it, it may not be very persuasive. So the point about the Hebrew prophets was that they had these revelations of God's will and they tried to communicate it, and most of the time they got killed or stoned or driven into exile. Most people didn't want to hear what they said. They were, as Jesus commented, most of the prophets ended up sort of persecuted in one way or another. It's not as if most people welcome these messages. They often don't. So revelation has always played a major part in religion because all religions ultimately depend on this direct experience of the divine. But I think what's happening in the modern world is instead of revelation being something that's considered to take place just in a few saints and mystics, St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, and so on, long ago and far away. This is something that's happening right now in modern Europe and America and all around the world through near-death experiences. No one knew how frequent these were until recently, and they're getting more frequent because more people are resuscitated from heart attacks and accidents thanks to modern medicine. No one knew how frequent mystic experiences were until Sir Alistair Hardy started doing a natural history of mystical experiences in the 1970s, and since then there have been many studies that have shown these are much more common than anyone recognized. And the widespread experience of psychedelics has also led to a huge increase in the number of people who've had these direct experiences which I think one can call revelation.
What did I ask?
Oh, I just started to thought it's not exactly connected with revelation, but we have talked about time and space. But Huxley says about distance that only middle distance is a human. That and he gives example of not astronauts but astronomers who are just looking very far, and then those physicists and chemists who look on molecular or automatic or sub-automatic level. In this case, the man could vanish or just lost his primacy. But what do you think about this?
I didn't quite get the question. Through science, we can see the very small and the very large. So then what was the actual question about this then?
What's the man's space in this huge range of space from subatomic to the galaxies?
Oh, you mean the human scale?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? In the Middle Ages, they had the idea of this ladder of being, or the scale of being, the great chain of being, which went from God through the angels and the stars, the celestial hierarchies, to humans, and then through animals and plants to rocks and minerals. So they had the idea that humans were somewhere in the midpoint of the realm of nature. Alexander Pope has a poem where he talks about it, something mankind in this middle state, not something small or great. It's something about the middle state, that humans occupy a kind of middle scale in this great scale of being, and that between God and the angels and the natural realm, in terms of our intellectual capacities, but also in terms of our actual scale. And I think, in a sense, the discovery of the microscopic realm and the quantum realm, through microscopes and then electron microscopes and then spectroscopes and through the atomic theory of matter, subatomic physics, has greatly expanded the realm of the small. It's made us go much further into the realm of the small. And through the discoveries of astronomy, we've greatly expanded the realm of the large. Until the 1920s, no one knew that there were any galaxies outside our own. The Milky Way was our own galaxy, and people thought that was the limits of the sky, with a few clouds and things a bit beyond it. But we now realize it's one among billions of galaxies in this vast universe, nearly 14 billion years old. So we've had a vast expansion of the large and the small, but I think it still leaves us somewhere in the middle. Before we were in the middle and the large and the small went sort of there and there. Now we're in the middle and the large and the small go there and there. So I don't think it changes this idea that we're somehow, at least from our own point of view, a pivotal point between these two realms of the very large and the very small. And also at a kind of pivotal point of consciousness, because the old idea of the great chain of being was that this is something that Descartes took up really, with the idea that you have God and angels and saints. You have spiritual realms above the normal human level, then you come to the human level, and then the old idea is you have realms of consciousness below the human level. You have sort of animals which have souls. I mean, the word anima means soul in Latin, and animal have souls. And then you have plants, then you have rocks and crystals, all with their own levels of organization or psyche or being, but at a lower level than ours, just as there are some at a higher level than ours, psychically and spiritually. So again, we had this sort of intermediate position.
Perhaps time for the last question. That's the issues that we discussed here. Reminded me of one of our trialogues from years back. I think the name of the trialogue was Entities, and you were talking about the disincarnate entities, and the whole question revolved around what's the what's the ontological status of these entities that appears in all the states of consciousness, basically. And McKenna says that something like that that if there were disincarnate intelligences, that would kind of seal the bankruptcy of the intellectual method, which is modern science, and that's why this problem has been handed to the psychologists, that you'll take care of that problem by legitimating one types of experiences over others. So do you remember that trialogue, I'd be interested in your comments on that, because this has got revolved in my head for quite some time.
Well, yes, I mean, I do remember the trialogue, and it was the first time I think I'd really discussed this question. Interestingly, this has now become a burning question. It's now being discussed a lot more. I was at a symposium last year here in Britain, which was exactly on the theme of entities as experienced under the influence of ayahuasca or DMT. It's sort of many people who've taken these psychoactive compounds experience entities, beings of seemingly autonomous beings, not just figments of our own imagination, but beings that seem to have an autonomy. I think Terence's point is that traditionally, when people have these experiences, they've been relegated to psychology, and if people say they're seeing these beings or hearing voices or something, then they're immediately classified as schizophrenic or pathologized. So no one's denied these experiences happened, because they do, but they've been pathologized, and so much so that a lot of people who hear voices or see beings without drugs don't want to talk about it, because they know that almost everyone in the room, if they mention it, will immediately think, aha, schizophrenia. So there's now here in Britain, and probably in other countries, something called a hearing voices network, which is a network of people who hear voices who are not schizophrenic. It may include some who are, but there are a lot of people who are not schizophrenic who hear voices or see visions. And they've had to form a network so they can talk to each other, because it reassures them, because they can't mention it to most people who would immediately assume they're mentally sick. This symposium I went to last year about entities was very interesting, because the question is, what is the ontological status? What are these beings?
Right.
And the sort of standard Western scientific view would be, well, they're just figments of our imaginations. They're produced by disordered activity in the brain, stimulated by neurotransmitter interference, psychedelic compounds and stuff. And they're nothing but internal imaginations. But for many people who've experienced, they seem to be more than that. So then the question would be, how do we map them? What maps do we have? Some people then use shamanic systems, because in shamanic traditions, it's taken for granted that there are autonomous entities. Shamans contact discarnate beings, deceased people, spirits of the dead, the ancestors, animal spirits, and various guides or spirit guides, including malicious ones. And of course, in traditional religious iconography and experience, there are ancestors, there are saints. I mean, after all, Roman Catholics regularly pray to saints who are considered to be autonomous entities in a spirit realm. I mean, you wouldn't pray to them unless you thought they existed. And people see visions of the Blessed Virgin Mary and other saints. So the saints are autonomous entities in traditional Catholicism, and so are the angels. And in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, it's always been believed that there are autonomous entities in the form of angels, and not just good angels. There are fallen angels, there are devils and demons and jinns in the Islamic tradition. There's all sorts of autonomous entities which are part of regular religions. In Hinduism, they have devas, the shining ones, countless devas. Those are probably their closest equivalent to angels. And, in Tibetan Buddhism, they have dakinis, sort of flying female spirits that can be called upon for help, as well as numerous gods and goddesses. So if you look at almost all religious traditions, except perhaps the most austere forms of Protestantism, then there's a general acceptance of all these entities. But even in Protestantism, in its most extreme forms, there's certainly a belief in the reality of God as a spirit being who is beyond the natural world, and also of Jesus. Jesus is believed to exist as an autonomous entity beyond the realm of death. So when we die, Jesus can help and guide us and on our journey after death, because he kind of has an autonomy, having overcome death through the resurrection and then the ascension, exists even in the most austere Protestantism as an autonomous entity. So even the most austere form has at least one autonomous entity, Jesus, and then as the more you go towards the Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox end of the spectrum, the number of autonomous entities increases dramatically. You have more and more angels and saints and ancestors, and praying for ancestors on the Day of the Dead, All Souls Day, very important in Mexico, throughout the whole Roman Catholic world and the Anglican world too. Praying for the dead. Those are believed to be autonomous entities as well, the ancestors. So I think that they're all believed to have some kind of ontological autonomy, but they're not embodied in any normal sense of the word. They have apparent bodies, because that's why you meet them, when you can see them. So they are embodied in the sense they're embodied in a visionary realm. They're extended in space and time. They're a location in a particular place. If you have a vision of the Virgin Mary, she's here, not there. So it's not as if it's totally spread out, diffused equally in all space. They're localized. And the idea of angels is also that they act locally. In St. Thomas Aquinas's book on angels, written in the 13th century, he has the idea that angels act in particular places and they can move from one place to another. But when they act in another place, then they're present in that other place. So they're not totally outside space and time. They're localized, and they're localized in their effects. And when people have visions of entities, they're localized in their visions as well. So this is very hard for anyone who thinks entirely in materialistic terms to accept. You can't accept it. It's just impossible. It's fantasy. It's childish fantasy, make-believe creatures like children have. But of course, children experience autonomous entities. They have imaginary friends and so on. So then that's just dismissed as a childish fantasy. So to defend the conventional point of view involves rejecting a great deal of experience. And I suppose you could argue that it's mental hygiene. It could be seen as a good thing, because then it means you don't get obsessed with spirit beings or potential demons or harmful agencies and stuff. But the fact is that the vast majority of humanity, through the vast majority of human history, including today, experience entities as autonomous beings in a mysterious, non-material world.
Well, thank you. Our hour is well up, and thank you much again for your time. What was, as always, very, very interesting. And thank you so much once again.
Thank you.
Good. All right. Thank you. Very good to have this chance to talk again.